through the review sheet. So we're going through the review sheet today. We'll go through it today, tomorrow, just make sure we go through everything that we need to cover. And then your test is Thursday, Friday. You will have 1 day, 1 class period Thursday to do part 1, 1 class period to do part 2. So, first thing we're looking at is factoring these quadratics. On 1 through 12, is there one of these in particular that y'all want to look at? We can start on the first page, 1 through 6. Well, we can look at number 1. The first step in factoring is to find the what? The greatest common factor across these 3 terms. And for this here, the greatest common factor is 7. So what we're going to do is divide each term by 7. So our 7b squared is going to become b squared minus 63 divided by 7 is going to become 9b plus 140 divided by 7 is going to become 20. Our second step is our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. So we'll have the 7, 2, 3. Third step is to find the sign. So if the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, the signs are opposite. So here the third term is positive, so the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. So we'd have negative and negative. Fourth step is to find the factors of the first and third term. Yes. The only factors for b squared are going to be b and b. Now our factors of 20 are 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. Which set of factors do we want to try first? 4 and 5. And the last step is to check. All right, guys. We're going to check this here. B times negative 5 is negative 5b. Negative 4. Yes. So this is the correct answer. So we check b times negative 5 and negative 4 times b, which do combine to give us negative 9b, which is the correct middle term, telling us that 7 times b minus 4 times b minus 5 is the correct set of factors. Questions on this here? Let's look at number 4. 6x squared minus 5x plus 1. Question? Or do you need to go back? Yeah. Okay. Got it? Or, all right. Let's look at number 4. So the first step is to determine if there's a greatest common factor between these 3 terms. For 6x squared, negative 5x, and 1. Well, there's not a common factor across all 3. So that means we move on to step number 2, our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Now, we can move on to step number 3 to find the sign. If the third term is negative, the signs are opposite. Yes. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. Now, since the third term is positive, signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. So we'll have, guys, let's focus up here, negative and negative. Now that brings us to our fourth step, the factors of the first and third term. So 6x squared, well, the x squared is going to be x and x. Factors of 6 are 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. Which set of factors do we want to try first? 2 and 3. And that brings us to our last step, which is to check. So we're going to do 2x times negative 1 first. It's negative 2x. Negative 1 times 3x would be negative 3x, giving us a middle term of negative 5x. And since that is the middle term we want, those are our factors. Questions on this here? Question, guys, focus up here. Questions on 1 through 6. Negative 3x, negative 3t squared plus 11t minus 6. Is there a greatest common factor between these three terms? There's not a number term, but if that first number is negative, we do need to factor the negative out. And all that's going to do is change the signs. The first term is going to go from negative to positive. The middle term is going to go from positive to negative, and our third term is going to go from negative to positive. Now at this point here, we're going to write our two sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Since the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. So we have negative and negative. Our next step is to find the factors of the first and third term. So 3t squared, well, t squared will be t and t. In fact, 3 is 1 and 3. Factors of 6 are 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. And we could try 2 and 3 first. Doesn't matter really what we try, we just need to plug these in and then check. Because when we check, we multiply the outer two terms, our 3t times negative 3, which gives us negative 9t. Then we'll do negative 2 times t, our middle terms, and negative 9t minus 2t, negative 9 minus 2, negative 11t. This is the correct middle term. Questions on 1 through 6? All right. Before we move on from factoring, let's look at number 8, 4n squared minus 49. This is a little different, but it's not that bad to factor. Since the term would be 0n, but this here is a difference of perfect squares. And it follows our a squared minus b squared is equal to a plus b times a minus b. And for us here, our a, because what times itself is 4n squared, what times itself is 4, 2n. And our b, it'd be what times itself is 49, 7. So this here would be 2n plus 7 times 2n minus 7. So what times itself is 49? Yep. because our a and b are, so a squared minus b squared, what times itself? A squared is our 4n squared, so 2n times 2n. 2n squared is our 4n squared. And 7 times 7 is 49, because really what we said in the middle is that we have 2n squared minus 7 squared, our a and b. So it becomes a plus b times a minus b. Now we can do the same set of steps that we did to factor this like we did on the last two. It will work the same. We just get a middle term of 0. Yeah. Because if we look at, say, 169x squared minus 144. All right, guys. What times itself is 169? Well, we could find that by just taking the square root of 196, not 169. Once this finishes loaded. Yep. Is 14. So this here, what times itself is a 196. Guys, last warning up here. 14. Yes. And what times itself is 144 is 12. So what we would get is 14x plus 12 times 14x minus 12. If we have time at the end. And we get this here. Now there is a greatest common factor between these two terms. 14 and 12 has a greatest common factor of 2. If we factor it out, we divide it out of both terms. We get 7x plus 6. We can do the same thing with our other factor, which gives us 7x minus 6. And our 2 times 2 is 4. So there's completely factored. This first one's factored. The other one is completely factored. I'm going to do 10 as the moment, because what times itself is a squared would be a. What times itself is 25b squared would be 5b. Telling us that this is a plus 5b times a minus 5b. Questions on this so far? Yes, because 2 times 2, since there's a greatest common factor of 2 here and here, we have to factor it out of both, and we're using multiplication because they're all being multiplied together. Questions on either one of these here? All right. We're ready to look at the next one. Okay. Questions on 11 or 12 before we move on? Okay. Let's look at 13 through 16. Which one of these do y'all want to look at?
13. I like 15. It's got a big number.
15. 1,089 squared minus 961 squared. Is 262,400.
Okay.
144 squared minus 64 squared. That's it, yeah. Put it right in the calculator. Don't change a thing. While we're at it, why don't we just go?
You're really cool.
Yeah. Just type it in exactly as you see it, and you'll get your answer. Questions on 13 through 16? We feel good with 13 through 16. All right. '17 through 23, solve each equation. Now there's going to be two specific ways that you're going to have to solve. The first one is by factoring. Second one is graphing. Thank you. So there's four main ways that you're going to have to factor on this test, especially part one. Part one is going to deal with the solving. It's going to be factoring, graphing, completing the square, and the quadratic formula. You don't have to write those down, but those are going to be specifically, it's going to ask for it. It's going to tell you to solve each of the following equations by factoring. You're going to need to solve it by factoring. You can solve it by other ways, but there are points assigned for doing it by the correct method. And there are points assigned for getting the correct answer. So if you do it by a method other than the one specified, you will get the points for getting it right. Yeah.
Are we taking the test today of the ATC thing?
So we'll figure that out. We'll have y'all take it at a different time. But you will have to do it by the specified method. If you don't and still get the correct answer, you will get the points for getting it right. You'll just lose the point or two assigned for doing the correct method. Completing the square. So if we look at number 17, it told us to solve it by graphing. Well, first thing I would do is grab the graphing calculator and graph the function. So we can hit y equals first. If there's anything in there, you'll need to clear it out. And we'll type our function in. So x squared plus 3x plus 2. So we type it in, and once we get it typed in, we're going to hit graph. Or we can hit second table, which will get us the table. And again, when we graph it, what we're looking for is what value of x will make the y value be 0. The values of x that make the y be 0 are -2 and -1. And that's it. So if it asks us to solve number 17 by graphing, we can use the graphing calculator. We graph it and look at the graph or look at the table for what values of x will make the y value be 0. We're looking for what values of x make the y value be 0. And that's it. Questions on this here? The other way we could have done this is by factoring. Because when we factor, we first look for a greatest common factor between these three terms. There is not one. So we move on to our second step. Two sets of parentheses multiplied together. So two sets of parentheses with three spaces. One thing I will say with factoring is it has to be equal to 0. And that goes with graphing too. Since the third term is positive, our signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. So we'd have plus and plus. Now we need to find the factors of the first and third term. Our factors of x squared are going to be x and x. Factors of 2 are 1 and 2. Now before we move on to solving, we're going to check and make sure we have the correct factors. So we'll multiply the outer two, x times 2. Since they're both positive, it would be positive 2x. 1 times x is going to be positive 1x. 2x plus x, 2x plus 1 would be 3x or 3. And it is positive, which does match our middle term. Questions on this so far? Now at this point here, we have two things that multiply together to equal 0, so one of them has to be 0. either x plus 1 is equal to 0, guys, or x plus 2 is equal to 0. And lastly, we have to solve for the value of x. So for the equation on the left, we would subtract 1 from both sides, telling us x is equal to -1. On the right, we would subtract 2 from both sides, telling us x is equal to -2, which again are the values we found by graphing. So x is equal to -1 and x is equal to -2. We will tell you. Yeah. Again, it's just going to be based off what it asks. So if it asks for factoring, you'll need to factor it. If it asks to graph, we'll graph it. So like 18, 0 equals x squared minus 9. If it told us to graph, solve these by graphing, first thing we'll do is grab the graphing calculator and hit y equals. Now we'll type it in because we're going to go x squared minus 9. We're going to type it in exactly as it looks and then hit graph. So it hits it twice. We're looking for two values. We're looking for what values of x will make the y value be 0. -3 and 3. So here the solutions are x is equal to -3 and x is equal to 3. And that's it. Questions on this here? Okay. Yes. Questions on this so far? Huh? Mainly for y'all. 19? 18? So we can factor 18. Because again, when factoring and graph,
You're right, because it's
difference of perfect
I
square.
was just looking at the last thing, and so
Yeah.
I was thinking about how if it's positive, you gotta look at the middle, but since it's not.
No, we can go on and factor it. Now, when factoring and graphing, the equation has to be equal to 0. If we're having to factor or graph, we need to set it equal to 0. Now, looking at this here, 9 is technically the third term. So it would be plus and minus. So x squared would be the first term, and the factor of the first term, x squared is x and x. Factors of 9 are 1 and 9, or 3 and 3.
So if that's a positive line, how would you be able to tell?
Well, if it was positive 9, we would have to do a different method. It doesn't technically factor. If we have time at the end, I will show you that. So here we can check x times -3 would be -3x. 3 times x would be plus 3x.
Will something like that be positive?
Not in a factored or graphing. We'd have to use completing the square or quadratic formula. Since we have 2 or more things that multiply together equal 0, one of them has to be 0. So either x plus 3 is equal to 0, or x minus 3 is equal to 0. So if we solve these here, just like with graphing, it tells us x is -3 and x is equal to 3. Questions on number 18? We good with those there? All right. I want to skip to 23. 20 and 21, we won't have one like that specifically on the test. Those are both square root method. There's not going to be a problem asking you to specifically use the square root method. Now, if you do want to see how those are done, I do have it in the full review video, and it's already posted on YouTube. So all the questions are covered. 23. There is two problems that look exactly like 23 that are on the test. So here, it's asking you to solve by factoring. Is it factored? That is factored, because factored is two sets of parentheses being multiplied together. This is factored. We don't have to do anything to it. It is already factored. And according to factoring, when we're solving, we get it to this form because now we have two things multiplied together that equal 0. So one of these two things has to be 0. So really, for both of the problems that look like this here, we split it up. We write both of these things equal to 0 and then solve. So for our 2x minus 7,
Just add 7 and then divide by 2,
we'd add 7 to both sides first.
which would just like 4 or 4.
Divide by 2, and we can leave it as 7/2.
Would you like be against us putting decimals down?
I wouldn't, as long as they're nice decimals. There's a few spots I wanted in fractions, but 3.5, that's fine. But if we get 0.3 repeated, 0.147 fraction. The next one here, the first thing we'd have to do is subtract 13 from both sides.
Divide by 5.
And divide by 5. And again, I put these on the test to be nice, because again, it's already in factored form. We just split it, because again, two things multiplied together equals 0. One of them has to be 0. So set them both equal to 0, solve for x, and you are done. Questions on any of these here? Okay.
We talk about that every day.
All right.
I turned 18, so I lost that when she graduated. How old you were? I graduated at 6. I turned 17. My birthday's over the summer, so I'm 1/8 throughout the entire year.
Any questions on this here?
She's younger than me. Oh yeah, I'm younger than a lot.
All right. Questions 24 and 25. Solve each equation by completing the square method, using the completing the square method. So again, guys, so problems, it's going to be worded similar to this here on the test. For factoring, graphing, completing the square of the quadratic formula, it's going to tell you these problems here, solve them by graphing. So you need to solve them by graphing. And really the graphing, just plug it into the calculator, solve there. If you want to borrow one of the graphing calculators to practice between now and then, that is perfectly fine. Just let me know, and you can do that there. Now for these here, solve each of these here by completing the square. So which one of these do we want to look at? 25. So now if we look at this here, the x squared terms, x's are on the same side. Constant term is by itself, because really that's where we're going to get to. If x's were on either side, if x squared's on either side, get them together. We want all the like terms together. So we're good there. Is a equal to 1? No. If not, make it so. So here we have to divide everything by 5. 5x squared divided by 5 is x squared. Plus 30x divided by 5 is going to be 6x. We'll leave a blank because we're going to have to find c and plug it in. And negative 50 divided by 5 is negative 10. So really, we did step 1 and step 2 at the same time. A was not 1, so we had to divide everything by 5. We did that. Step 2 is to get the constant term by itself. Okay, well, it is. And leave 2 spaces. Because the reason we leave 2 spaces is we're going to find this value of c, which is b over 2 squared, and plug it in. Now, our value of b in this case is what? B is 6, because again, it's referring back to our ax squared plus bx plus c. So here, b is 6. More importantly, it's positive 6. Now, positive 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So we're going to add 9 to both sides. We're going to plug that value of c in. And last but not least, we're going to factor this and then solve. So we need to factor our x squared plus 6x plus 9. It is going to be 3, specifically positive 3, because the number that goes inside the parentheses, when we factor it, is the same number that goes inside the parentheses or is inside the parentheses before we square it when finding c. Now the other side, negative 10 plus 9 is negative 1. At this point here, we need to solve, so we're going to take square root of both sides. On the left-hand side, the square root and square would cancel, leaving us with x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus. We need to simplify that radical. Now, normally we plug it into the 30xs, but we can't plug a negative. And this here would end up simplifying to I. If what's inside is negative, we'll pull the negative out as I, and then simplify the square root, which just works out to be I. And last but not least, we need to subtract 3 from both sides, telling us x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus I. Now, since negative 3 and I are not like terms, that is as simplified as it gets. If we can add or subtract them, we need to add or subtract. If we cannot, we leave it here. Because if that term that comes out of the radical still has a radical or has I or has both a radical and I, that's as far as it goes. If it simplifies to just a number, we have negative 3 plus 5. We need to add, we need to subtract. Questions on 25? Questions on 24? Yes, sir. Because we can look at 24. Now, 24, since it's already all on the same side, we'll leave it. Equal to 0, we're good there. Like terms are together. Is a equal to 1? No. We're going to divide everything by 2. And again, on the test, both the completing the squares, the values of a are going to be 1. You're not going to have to do anything with a. So for like 24, if it was on the test, we're going to be starting here, not what we actually were given, because the value of a is going to be 1 for both of the completing the squares on the test. So we can really just move to step number 2. Get the constant term by itself. So we're going to add 12 to both sides and then leave 2 spaces. X squared minus 6x plus blank equals 12 plus blank. C is equal to b over 2 squared. Almost. B this time is going to be negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And negative 3 squared is 9. Questions on this so far? Now we do need to factor the left-hand side. Our x squared minus 6x plus 9 is going to factor 2x minus 3 squared, because we take whatever's inside the parentheses before we square it to find what goes inside our parentheses when factoring. The other side's 12 plus 9, which is 21. At this point here, we can take square to both sides. Here, the square root and square will cancel. X minus 3 is equal to plus or minus. It does not. So the square root of 21 is just square root of 21. Now again, even at this point here, I would make sure that square root simplifies, because if it does, I need you to simplify it. Questions on 24, 25? Because square root of 21 does not reduce. The only way we can is it reduces to a non-repeating, non-terminating decimal. It's irrational. Yeah, it just keeps going on and on and on. Questions on 24, 25? And again, I would show your steps. If you get the right answer, awesome. If not, I will go back and check and make sure, because again, there's points for finding C, there's points for factoring it correctly, there's points for actually solving it. So there are breakdowns for each of the points. Quadratic formula. So quadratic formula, x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And this is again matching up to our ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Really, ax squared plus bx plus c. We do need to get this equal to 0. We do need to get this equal to 0 for us to be able to solve these here. Do we want to look at 26 or 27? 26. Now the first thing we need to do with this here is get this equal to 0. So we'll add 5. We need to get it equal to 0, so we're going to add 5 to both sides. We add 5 because the 5 was negative. So A is 4, B, so A is negative 4, B is 3, C is 5. So negative B, so we'd have negative 3 plus or minus, guys, square root of, guys, up here, face forward, thank you, B squared, so 3 squared minus 4 times A times C, so 4 times negative 4 times 5, all over 2 times negative 4. And again, with the quadratic formula, I would give me at least this here. Because again, there are points for making sure you set this up correctly. You plugged in the correct values for A, B, and C. At this point here, our negative 3 is going to become negative 3. The denominator, 2 times negative 4 is negative 8. At this point here, we're going to plug all of this inside the radical into the calculator. So our 3 squared minus 4 times negative 4 times 5. 3 squared minus 4 times negative 4 times 5 is 89. Now we need to make sure that the square root of 89 does not reduce. It does not. So that tells us x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 89 over 8. If you can get at least this here, you'll get all the points. If we really wanted to simplify it, we would take that negative out of the bottom and distribute it across the top, because having the denominator, the bottom of the fraction, positive is helpful. But by doing this, it's going to turn the 3 from negative to positive. It's going to flip the plus or minus, well, just making it plus or minus. Because the positive becomes negative, the negative becomes positive, so it really doesn't affect the plus or minus. Giving us this here. Because the main things with the quadratic formula that I'm looking for is, did you set it up correctly, plug in the correct values for A, B, and C, and did you simplify the radical in our terms? If you did not fully simplify, if there was a greatest common factor on the two terms on top and bottom, I'm not going to take out points if you don't fully simplify that there. It would be great if you did, but if you didn't, that's fine too.
Is that all it is? Oh,
We'll finish the rest of this tomorrow.